All right, everyone. It's 10:01, so I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. Nice to see you all. My name is Kayla Anderson. I'm an Enterprise Solutions Architect at AWS, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how to make the transition from developer, engineer, director, etc., to a cloud architect. So on your agenda, I think it was going to say this talk is given by someone called Randy Defoe. He's a principal solutions architect at AWS and one of my mentors within the SA org. Unfortunately, he tested positive for COVID yesterday, so you're getting me instead. Where Randy had been at AWS for over 5 years. He's a principal SA with very high-level responsibilities for overall thought leadership. I've been at AWS for a year and a half, and so I more recently made the switch from senior engineer tech lead level over to AWS as an SA. So maybe for some of you, depending on where you are at your careers, that will be more pertinent, but I will talk a little bit about how the leveling within the solutions architecture roles at AWS works and kind of how the responsibilities change as you move up levels to more senior levels or come in at more senior levels. So welcome. I'll try to make this as helpful as I can for you. Sorry, I'm not Randy. All right, so I'll talk a bit about my career path. It's probably most certainly very different than most of the people here, just given the subject of the conference. So my area of depth by training and experience is more in machine learning, big data analytics, distributed data processing, real-time processing. But I'll talk a bit about how various career paths and tech depths all kind of filter into the solutions architect role and what that actually means. So my career path, my undergrad, I studied ecology and evolutionary biology and geographic information systems. So almost entirely all of my programming knowledge from undergrad came from one Python class I had to take as part of my GIS major. Once I graduated, I started as a GIS analyst and programmer for a civil engineering firm. So I mostly did things like hydrology modeling, raster modeling, Python programming to automate all of that. And eventually, after a few years of that, I decided that I wanted to work in a broader space beyond just the geographic data space. And that's when you started hearing things about data science and predictive analytics. It was becoming kind of a hot topic. So I actually went back to school for more data science specific training and leaning more on kind of my statistics background that I got in my undergrad. Once I graduated that, I became a data scientist and eventually a machine learning engineer for a startup in Denver. They're called Ibotta. I don't know if anyone's heard of them. They were about 100 people when I joined, and now they're around 600 people, own an MBA team, all of that good stuff. So I was there, early on in our analytics group. We really didn't have any differentiation between analysts versus, more of a data engineer type. We had about 12 people on our team, and eventually over my time there, we grew to a 50-person analytics team with various roles like data engineers who worked on more big data pipelines, machine learning engineers that productionalized machine learning models, data scientists and analysts that did more, how do I explain this to the CEO type problems. So through that experience, I gained a lot of knowledge on AWS, scaling platforms, scaling companies, scaling data, and become a much more fluent, well-rounded engineer. From there, I decided to go into consulting, and then eventually became a failed consultant and became a data architect for one of my clients. From there, that's when I transitioned into the solutions architect role. I had actually met my now manager of managers back when I was a data scientist at Ibotta, and he introduced the SA role and actually tried to recruit me then. At the time, I wasn't sure what that meant or if it was a fit for me, so it took me a few years before I kind of tapped him on the shoulder and was like, okay, I might be interested now. So now I'm at AWS, a solutions architect. I'm an enterprise solutions architect, so that basically means I work as a generalist, even though I do work in my area of depth in certain areas where I lean into more. I have a list of a few customers in the enterprise group. They're larger customers that spend like $1 million or more, I believe is the cutoff per year on AWS, and I essentially act as sort of a technical guide for all of the departments that are working on AWS, might be working on AWS, to give prescriptive guidance, training, etc. And then in my area of depth around analytics and machine learning, I work heavily to publish like blog posts or build workshops for training, that type of thing. So I'll get into the role a bit more as we keep going, but that's been kind of my arc of where I've been and where I am now. In my current role, we'll talk a bit about the various people that have come in, but I would say short story is people from all sorts of different backgrounds become solutions architects. My story does not look anything like many of my coworkers' story and so on. So I think probably everyone in this room knows that the cloud is a big deal. It's growing and growing. So you see here reports on the amount of spend is growing per company. From a cloud architect or solutions architect role, what that really translates to is workloads are growing, both in the volume of workloads and the variety of workloads. So that may mean one of my customers had one cloud operations team that is doing some cool forward-thinking stuff on AWS that I've been helping them out with. And then they might eventually say, well, we have a data warehouse that's on premises. We want to migrate that too. Or we have all of our workloads on premises that we need to evaluate and migrate. So as cloud architects, the different departments that you work with is constantly expanding. The scope of what you're working on is constantly expanding. As many of our customers, even our larger customers, their total technology workloads might still be 10% in the cloud, and they're continuously trying to migrate. So the kind of questions that I'm asked and the type of workloads I'm evaluating are constantly changing for each of those customers and tend to not look like they did before. So my role as a cloud architect, the big things we think about are that prescriptive guidance on giving them advice on what patterns or procedures or services are going to work best for them. And a big part of this is just balancing trade-offs. We do not compromise on operational excellence or security, so that may mean I make sure all their workloads are secure as far as how the network traffic can flow in and access data or machines, firewalls, et cetera. You guys all know that probably better than I do, frankly. But then also operational excellence can mean things like high availability. Do you have a workload that you can have 0% downtime? In that case, we may need to deploy in multiple AWS regions and have some sort of failover mechanism to make sure that you can keep operations going on those highly critical workloads in the event of an outage in an AWS data center. We also evaluate performance, scalability, and cost. In general, what this looks like is that we talk with our customers and gather their technical and business requirements. So that includes things like traffic patterns, how do you need to scale? Can you scale vertically or horizontally, or can we get you to a place where you can scale horizontally? What is your latency requirement? What are the traffic patterns, spiky or steady state? What type of programming languages are the engineers that are working on this comfortable with? Those kinds of things, and we always have to evaluate what trade-offs are there and give them a few options on how can they maximize this. And you may have seen, that triangle, fast, good, cheap, like pick two. Often you kind of have those same problems where the most performant solution may not be the most cost efficient, and trying to find those lines with the customers about what levels are acceptable and what solution makes the most sense for them. We have a builder culture at AWS, which means before I work with any of my customers, you really have to do a lot of legwork to make sure you understand what you're teaching them about. So I told you before that my background is in analytics and machine learning. I now work across all 200 plus of AWS services, so that's networking, security, serverless, web dev, and then of course my favorites, machine learning and analytics. So often, the level of conversations I will have with customers will change based on, what level of depth do they need. So if I'm going to be working with their principal security engineer who's very cloud fluent, I may tap the shoulder of a security specialist clouds architect and have them have that conversation. Whereas I will often cover things like, does this architecture overall make sense? You kind of get a feel for the various patterns the longer you're in the role. So as more and more time goes by, generally your depth across that breadth of services should also increase. Generally, our big deliverables are some form of an architecture recommendation. So that could be diagram. Sometimes it's a document, listing the various trade-offs I'm thinking about when recommending certain things and various option A versus option B and what the trade-offs are there. Some cost analysis. Security is always number one priority, but after that, almost every customer, the next question is, how can I make this cost less? And then also demos. And I would say often I do proof of concepts for customers, so they're thinking about building something a certain way. I can't actually go hands-on keyboards within their environment for security reasons, but I can often just spin up a proof of concept of this is the overall workflow I'm thinking for you, this is how it would work. Within that, there's a few other subcategories, like many of the workshops that you can access publicly on AWS, blog posts, books, AWS samples on GitHub. Most of that is actually maintained by AWS solutions architects. So in addition to helping our customers directly, we also work heavily on the overall thought leadership to enable AWS customers at large to work better and understand best practices, best patterns, have some sort of documentation to go off of. And as AWS expands, all of that documentation, workshops, best patterns is kind of a living, breathing organism that's always expanding too. So types of roles that go into this cloud architect role. And I should mention, I'm heavily indexing on AWS Solutions Architect version of this, since that's obviously what my role is and what I know best. But you can also become a cloud architect for consulting companies like Solemn or Deloitte, and kind of oversee and provide recommendations for migration statements of work. Some companies, especially larger companies, will have cloud architects on staff themselves that work at that kind of higher level overall design pattern level of work. And often me at AWS will interface with that person often to discuss best practices or ideas we have. So anyway, moving on after that aside, the types of roles, very, very diverse. The broad level, I would say most people that become an SA role are either going to be heavily indexing from a tech background, like myself, more of an engineer. But we also have people that were, I would say, less technical. So say people that were like sales engineers for a company before. They may understand the tech but not have heavy background on actually developing it. However, when you get new people into the role, you often see kind of a split in our abilities between those two backgrounds. People that were lighter on tech might need to do some more digging and like hands-on practice with all of our services to really fully understand enough to like guide our customers. But then people like me who were more technical, I really have to work on presenting, teaching out, things that were not something that I used to do as part of my day-to-day in the technical role. And you'll be surprised by how hard it is when you think you know a service or a pattern really well, when you then have to explain it to a CTO of a big company. It takes a few more practice runs to get comfortable having those conversations. And then as far as area of depth within those two splits, obviously AWS has 200 plus services across all types of areas of depth. Networking, analytics, serverless, I've kind of named them already, a few of them. So we often have people where their historic area of depth is really in one of those pillars. Like they're a DBA person in a previous life and really know databases really well, how to optimize them, when to choose what database. So we have people like that. We have, one of my coworkers was an engineer on Lambda within AWS before he switched to solutions architect role. I come from more of an analytics ML background. So really it's anyone that is technical, and when you start to look at AWS, in the interview process, we really don't test on AWS services, but test on like more fundamentals. Like, do you understand how a 3-tier web app works? You don't necessarily need to know, the documentation for each of our services back and forth, but they may test you a little harder on what is your area of depth, enough to see, do we think that we can teach you to expand your breadth across all of these various areas. So we get people from all sorts of backgrounds, and frankly, you'll probably be deficient in something. And it's just kind of a constant battle to keep learning both technical things, services that are changing. If you are more of a technical hands-on developer, do you need to work on how you communicate both written and presentation? So it's just a big evolution, honestly. But anyone that's technical, I think, can be successful in this role. All right, so this is a bit more about the same kind of flows we see. Often on the left-hand side, you'll see some traditional job postings for, could be cloud or on-premises workloads, to maybe more cloud-native versions as a company might evolve and get onto the cloud, and then how they all can flow into this cloud architect role where you are more of a technical guide for these people at companies to make this migration or transformation successfully. So for example, traditional IT support might become a site reliability engineer when they may not have a data center anymore. But all AWS and all clouds do run on data centers, right? So those jobs still exist, maybe not within a company-specific role. Data analysts, kind of like my evolution here. I started with analytics and programming back when we could store all of our data on machines, and did. And I would get really beefy laptops that could handle the modeling. Whereas now I can send all my modeling, have it compute, stored in the cloud. With that, you've seen a huge transformation on how data architecture is designed. So we have much bigger data than we had before. We have new frameworks like Spark and Hadoop that distribute that data processing, new programming languages and paradigms that have come with that transformation. Similar with developers, often on-prem you'll see people that are very fluent in like a monolithic single virtual machine design, and their entire web app or what have you is built on that. When you go cloud native, we have all of these new frameworks and paradigms that make that transition, I would say, much more cost efficient, much easier to manage. So these are things like serverless and event-driven designs, Lambda, step functions, event bridge, that type of stuff. That's something where microservices event-driven design only came about because we could go cloud native, and once the cloud started. So it's something where those skills may transition to like a new paradigm in the cloud. And then again, they can all kind of flow into this cloud architect. Can I be a guide for people who are trying to go through this journey? Can I give them advice? Can I give build patterns for them to follow? Can I build blog posts about what are the best patterns to follow that then millions of AWS customers will look to as documentation, essentially? So education qualifications. Imagine a lot of people here do have engineering backgrounds or technical backgrounds, but I think the other thing is that we've learned there are a lot of ways to learn things, especially for technology. There are things you can teach yourself. There are things that you can learn on the job. A big part of being a solutions architect is many of us were, when we were in school, what we're using today didn't exist, right? So I think the bigger thing is how can you translate what you know into cloud native designs? Can you understand the trade-offs that you're making when choosing patterns? And can you constantly be learning? Higher learning is for you, not your employer, although it helps to get them for your employer. I would say generally, especially when it comes to things like cloud, those are very profitable skill sets that are highly in demand, right? So if you put in the time to teach yourself new skills or get certifications, those are things that can just make you, a more lucrative employee for somebody to recruit. So it is for you and for your career. And this last point, certifications are as valuable as the work you put into getting them. That one I would definitely say is very true. As a SA at AWS, we have, I think, 12 different certifications now. So it's like solutions architecture and then specialties like security and networking. Part of my job to be a technical guide, I need to go get some of these certifications. And with most tests, there's a pattern to them. So some people can get really good at taking tests. And sometimes that translates into being really good at implementing them or giving guidance on them. And sometimes it just means they got good at taking tests. So I think if you use the certifications as an opportunity to actually learn things, kick the tires and actually try running some of the services or tools that you're learning, that'll actually make you a more valuable asset. All right, and sales. So this is when I went back to my career arc and when I first got introduced to the SA role. He told me it was pre-sales, and I thought, I'm very technical. I don't know if that's really my jam. So it took me a while to come around to that idea. SAs within AWS were part of the pre-sales organization. So essentially, that means we don't have quotas. Salespeople at AWS do, but solutions architects do not. We have customers. And within AWS, it's really about building trust between you and your customers. And that's even true with the salespeople. It's not about getting them to move a workload that day. It's about making sure we're building a relationship where it's mutually beneficial in the long term. So often that will mean I do probably my most common engagement is a cost optimization session. So I actually spend a lot of time trying to help my customers save money on their AWS bill. And that's the kind of stuff that I get rewarded for. So I don't really feel like I'm in a sales role. Generally, it's more about, are we making it so that the adoption of AWS is very seamless for customers? So a big part of that is I have a customer that wants to start doing machine learning. They might need some training. So I will do some training to enable that they can, implement machine learning, and it's successful doing so. And so that's what all these architecture reviews, guidance, et cetera. The goal is that over the long run, AWS is more widely adopted because we're making it easy, accessible, and providing support along the way. And then I should mention, we do have a broader ecosystem of platform and partners that really scale that adoption. So again, that's consulting companies who might implement the migrations, as well as platforms like Snowflake things that are cloud native implemented on top of AWS that make things easy. All right, so characteristics of a good SA. I talked about this a little bit, but you really want to be always curious and wanting to learn. As I mentioned, you're going to come in deficient in some form or fashion. And even if you're not, you're going to want to get to those higher level positions even within a cloud architect vertical. So I mentioned I'm a year and a half into AWS. I work very closely with my customers. I do contribute to blog posts and workshops. Someone like Randy, who was supposed to present today, and he's a principal SA, he is flying all around the western US and to Seattle to meet with CTOs of very large organizations and tell them, you're going to exit all your data centers, and it's a $20 million exit strategy. We need to evaluate all of your workloads, make sure we have architectural guidance. They often are writing books. Their production for this broader thought leadership is generally at a higher level. So as you, depending on what level you come in on, you might be already operating at that higher level, or you may be growing your skills either in your tech depth, your presentation skills, how you can communicate writing, in order to build yourself into a force multiplier. And that's really what all the cloud architects within AWS are there for, is how big of a force multiplier are you to enabling AWS adoption for all of our customers, both people you talk to directly and then people that just read the AWS blog or use our training at large. All right, and then getting started, I just mentioned already that there are many ways to learn things, and that's very true of the cloud and technology generally. So I just mentioned a few places where I'm always upping my skills. You have everything from accessible online courses like a Cloud Guru or Udemy if you're a lecture type of learner. Vendor conferences, things like this where you're actually hearing from people who implemented patterns, what worked, what didn't, or best practices. Blog posts, both from AWS. As I mentioned, we are always trying to put best practices and patterns out there, but then also from other companies. Most companies maintain something like a Medium where they are talking about what their problem was, how they solved it, what it looked like, and constantly learning from each other. Documentation, a given, and then sample code. Build it and kick the tires on it. So for AWS specific stuff, we have workshops.aws, and then we also have AWS samples on GitHub. All right, I think that is it for me. Thank you for the time.